Welcome to WorkBuzz's summer series. We're doing a quick deep dive exploring 4 topics we know move the needle on employee listening. And today, we're talking about listening maturity. More specifically, what we'll be talking about is the progression of listening maturity programs. So how do you go as an organisation from where you are today to where you want to be in terms of your ambition for engagement and performance? Today, I'm joined by Ryan, our VP of People Science and expert on all things engagement. Ryan and his team have sat with over 100 leadership teams in the last year, exploring survey findings and action plans, and he's going to share some of the insights with us. Well, Ryan, shall we get straight to it?
Let's do it.
Okay, great. So when it comes to listening maturity and progression, we know really well that employee engagement drives performance. There's plenty of research out there that links engagement through to performance, and we know about things like the service profit chain. The logic is simple. Happy employees create happy customers that create more profit and return for an organisation. But knowing that, why do you think so many organisations know that, but still treat listening as a tick box exercise?
It's a great question. I wonder sometimes whether organizations really believe it. So we can hear it, we can read about it in different research, different seminars, conferences we go to. But for a leadership team to really believe in it to the point where that's where they want to invest their time and their resource and say, and have that confidence that we're going to invest in listening to our people and we're going to action on what we hear from them, really believing that it's going to lead to better outcomes for the business. I think there's still a gap that exists there. Of course, there are ways in which you can help organizations try to understand it by linking how their colleagues feel, the engagement of their colleagues to business outcomes, performance, productivity, health and safety, customer experience, customer buy-in behavior. The challenge is until you do that, you're asking leadership teams who are incredibly busy, have their own priorities, their own ideas on what they need to do to deliver on their business strategy. You're asking them to almost put their faith in something that they're going to have to wait quite a bit of time to see the benefit for. It's not something that is going to bring overnight results with engagement and culture. You really have to believe in it. You have to role model it on a day-to-day basis and trust that it's going to lead to some of those outcomes that you've alluded to. A bit like going to the gym, you have to, it's a process. You have to be consistent with it and you have to trust that the results that you want to see are going to come. And I really do see engagement and culture in that same way for organizations. And I've seen a lot of leaders almost question whether that kind of theory is actually going to play out in their own workplace. And so the only real way around it to get them to truly believe in it is to show them it in their own business kind of reality, their own business metrics.
Fab. And when you see leaders that buy into it, what do they look like and how does that translate from organisation to organisation for them?
Again, I suppose from experience, a lot of what I've seen is or felt is the energy or the vibe in a room when going through, whether it's an employee survey or general research kind of outputs for an organization, and actually just seeing the way in which they're engaging with certain data points, the questions that they ask, the amount of time that they want to spend reflecting on, as a leadership team, what does this say about us? What does this say about the business? How are we going to follow this up? When you're working with leadership teams who aren't really connected to it, they're waiting for the presentation or however you're delivering the results to be finished, maybe mop up with a couple of very high level questions around benchmarking and then move on to something else. Whereas I've sat in a lot of rooms with some leadership teams who really have the curiosity to want to explore, what does this insight really mean for us? What can we do to try and show colleagues that we've heard them, that we understand how they're feeling? How can we explore some of that piece around how is this actually driving some business outcomes, and therefore what are we going to do about this? And they want to create that collective accountability as a leadership team there in the room. So I would normally say to myself with some employee research, if you're not getting that kind of level of energy and striking up that conversation with those senior leaders, it's a real sign that they're not kind of connecting at the right level. And you need to then start to think about, how do we reposition this and tell the story in a different way that's going to connect with this audience?
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think that very much speaks to another question I was about to ask you, which is about, what does the transition actually look like from listening just being a survey to being embedded into how people change and drive an organization forward? You said about leadership curiosity being one of those first almost triggers for you as an external consultancy. This is an organization that's truly switched on to that. Are there any other changes that you observe in organizations that are truly embedding listening into their programs that are more tangible and something that you can feel?
I think the organizations that have got there to, a place where they've got listening truly embedded into the way in which they do business, it's almost part of the culture there. It's where everyone knows that there's really good listening that happens at all levels across the organization. Come back to what I mentioned about, they haven't got there overnight. That's been a process. It's taken time for them to embed that properly in their culture, because every leader needs to role model it. Every manager needs to be role modeling it. Colleagues need to have that trust that actually, I know that I can express my honest views and opinions here, and it's going to be listened to. Not everything will get acted on at all times, but some of it will be. So the reason that more organizations aren't in that place is because lots of organizations have tried to almost shortcut their way there, or they've not put the building blocks down first. So if we think about where engagement research was maybe 20 years ago, it was third-party ran, big consultancy piece where you would run one big survey, sometimes more than 100 questions. 6 or 8 weeks later, you would get big dossiers back of all of this information, scores, data points, and then the action planning point and piece would almost take the rest of the year before you then maybe run some more research. Organizations then started to hear about this idea of continuous listening or pulse listening, and moving to quarterly, monthly, or even weekly surveys at times. The challenge was lots of organizations were moving towards those different cadences or approaches of their employee listening when their culture and their business wasn't quite ready for it or set up for it to be successful. Inevitably, what then happens is it doesn't work, it doesn't have the impact, and then people start to lose confidence and trust in the whole process. As a result, we're starting to see lots of HR practitioners and lots of business leaders saying employee listening hasn't really worked for us, and they're almost moving away and going back to less frequent listening, which is absolutely not what businesses need to do. We need to be, at this time more than ever, really hearing from our people and understanding their ideas, their experiences, and using it to help us lead our businesses forward. So how to think about that consists of really honestly reflecting on your organizational context, whether that's your history with listening or just what you're going through as a business at the moment. Are you going through a merger and acquisition? Well, that's a really good time to be hearing from your people. Lots of businesses sometimes think it's the opposite and that they shouldn't be, but it's a really good time to understand the culture of the new organization, the culture of the existing, how colleagues are feeling, how we can support them through it. But that should be the focus of the listening rather than more general kind of engagement survey type questions. How bought in our leaders, how confident and capable are managers in working with the insights within their teams. That's going to be critical for thinking about how you approach your colleague listening. Are you starting from a point of high levels of trust from colleagues, or a high level of cynicism based on their previous experience with surveying? And that's going to factor into how often we want to run surveys, what we want to ask them for feedback around. So for any organization that's really thinking about their colleague listening program, the starting point is to really reflect on, what do we need to learn from colleagues to get the business and the culture of the organization where we need it to get to, where are our insight gaps? But then also thinking about the whole mechanism of listening and seeing where the potential blockers and barriers are throughout that. So without leaders really championing it and really connecting with this, efforts will kind of fall flat. So how do we make sure we're able to tell the story to them, connect it to other business metrics, do that groundwork to make sure we're able to tell that story in that way before we run the survey? If we don't have managers who have the time or the capability, the capacity to really engage with data and kind of lead action planning within their teams, how are we going to plan for that ahead of running the survey? Because all of that will ultimately influence whether action planning happens, whether colleagues really hear anything happening with their feedback. And as soon as it doesn't, you've lost the faith in the process, and every survey from there on in is going to become more difficult.
Yeah. You mentioned about a lot of the differences that exist around a more mature organisation in terms of their listening maturity to those that are right at the start. And as you said, it may be that frequency could be a teller, the leadership buy-in, the ability of managers, or just employee perception there. But from your experience, based on the hundreds of hours you and your team have spent with people and HR teams, what are the best people and HR teams doing differently to nudge those things along and get them where they kind of need to be for their organisation?
Genuinely feel that it's about having authenticity in the listening kind of strategy. So come back to, what do you need to know from your people at this particular moment in time? You know, not running surveys for surveys' sake, not always just wanting to ask questions on a scale that will give you lots of benchmarking data. Like, what do you really...
Repeating the same questions?
Repeating the same questions over and over. Start to put your previous listening through the lens of, does this feel like something that's been designed to listen to our colleagues, or does it feel like it's been designed to give us information that we want to know as HR teams? And what you'll likely find is it's going to fall more into the latter.
Yeah.
And when you get out there and you engage with colleagues, what they'll often say is, well, the questions don't often feel relevant for me, or, you know, accessibility to even take part in it is harder for me. I'm working out in a factory, and, you know, I'm not sitting behind a desk. I don't have a work email. And you hear these kind of challenges where colleagues will think, actually, this whole thing doesn't feel like it's for me. It feels like it's for the organization. So there's a piece there. Other HR and people teams who are doing this piece really well are not accountable for it. They're driving it. They want to champion it. They want to encourage and support the business to be able to do this really well. But they've been able to get to the point where leaders and managers are really taking ownership of this. Again, I think a way in which they can achieve that is more involvement. So sit down with your leaders and managers and understand what they need from this for this to be valuable. Explore what other metrics are happening, what's happening in their worlds that you can give them some insight around that's going to help them with their roles. Engage with employee networks and forums to understand, what have they not liked about previous surveys? What have some of the challenges been? What would they love the opportunity to provide some more feedback around? You know, make this a real business piece rather than an HR or people and culture team piece. That's the main differentiator between those that are doing it really well.
Thank you. If we think about AI, it can now summarize data in terms of open comments and closed information and data, but especially when it comes to the open comments, that those of us that have been in the employee listing space for many years, you'd be taking home pages upon pages of open comments to read through, try and summarize them, try and categorize them, and going through that research yourself. Now with tooling like AI, that can be done within minutes, within seconds sometimes, and that is super powerful. But with AI, obviously, comes a little bit of taking the human out of the process. So my question to you is, when it comes to AI and employee listening, where do you think it adds value, and where, on the contrary, is it taking away from the actual process which is meant to engage people?
Yeah, I would say the simplest way of thinking about that question is, again, putting the way in which you're using AI as part of your employee listening through the filter of, is it helping and guiding, or is it doing it for us?
Yeah.
If it falls more into the latter, you're going to have a problem.
Okay.
Because what happens is, if we let's look at all aspects of employee listening. If you ask AI to recommend what you should be asking colleagues about, it's going to be generic. And it's not going to understand your unique business context and think about and know everything that you've asked previously, what's on the horizon for your organization. Some of the bits we've talked to around really understanding what colleagues want to provide more feedback around. So if you do that work, AI could support with thinking about good questions to ask in that particular space, that particular theme, for example. On the survey side, you've run a survey, you've got some results. AI can be fantastic at doing what you've suggested, theming, helping you understand how, you're an organization of 10,000 colleagues, 8,500 have taken part in the survey, and 80% of them have left free text comments on 2 different questions. Tell me really simply, in no more than 300 words, what are colleagues talking about? Or what are the top 3 themes that they say they love about this organization? What are the top 3 themes where they're suggesting things they would love to improve? That is a great use case of AI with listening, or helping managers and leaders avoid that pitfall of just going to what the low scores are and actually giving them the headlines of, this is what your team are feeling. This is what would make a big difference to their engagement moving forward. This is how you could really improve performance within your team. But if you play it back in that way, really powerful for them. What it shouldn't do is do the whole piece of, this is what your data is saying, this is exactly what you should do about it.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm going in that direction with it is because there's a real risk with AI that we ask AI to kind of generate action plans for us, for example. So rather than guide and make suggestions and be there to almost kind of coach and help you navigate something, there's a risk with AI that you could say, here are the results for a later survey for my team, create me an action plan. And it's there for you at the click of a button. The risk with doing that is that you're not having managers, leaders emotionally and intellectually connect with what their teams are feeling and really do a deeper reflection of, why might the team be feeling that way? How am I going to go and explore this and share with the team that this is what we've heard, this is what you're saying, this is the understanding that I have, let's explore that more. But more importantly, let's explore what we could do, what are the solutions, what are the actions. Combine that with some AI support and guidance.
Yeah.
And I think that's a real strong use case. But there is a risk there, like with anything with AI, that we kind of try to delegate everything to it.
Agreed. Yeah. I think a lot of people speak about the importance of human in the loop when it comes to AI tooling. And that's something that absolutely in engagement surveys we shouldn't lose sight of.
Yeah, absolutely. And similar with communications, there's so much research out there about individuals being a little bit skeptical around pure AI-led comms, whether that's video-based or text or audio-based. So just making sure that there's a real authenticity in there. And we know that the authenticity comes from the human side of it.
Yeah.
So again, use AI to kind of guide and support, but it shouldn't be doing all of the work.
Of course.
Particularly when it comes to listening, and what we're playing back and talking to colleagues about are often quite personal things, in the sense that they're really important to them, important to the point where they've wanted to feed it back in something like an employee survey.
Yeah. I think also just, a word of warning to many of our listeners is around AI tooling and where that data flows to as well. It's something that I know at WorkBuzz, it's been something that's really clear on our agenda about keeping that data secure, making sure that it isn't training other models, it's kept in a safe place. So again, for HR and people practitioners that might not be as au fait with where things might go to, or being really conscious of that, responsibility is really critical for them and the managers that they're leading through any employee listening.
Absolutely. And coupled with that, I suppose, is the data and privacy concerns from the colleagues themselves. So colleagues want to know, how is this data being used? Who's going to see it? And that includes whether it's going to be used and analyzed by a third party, by AI, and things like that. So I think, making sure, again, we're really, really clear in our understanding of it. Yeah. And how we communicate it to colleagues.
Great. So a huge proportion of the workforce are people that are on shop floors or in warehouses, frontline or deskless workforces that exist. I say a huge proportion. It's the majority of the workforce that don't sit in front of desks and laptops like you and I on a day-to-day basis. When it comes to that difference of employee audience that are on the front line, how should listening ambition change for those types of organisations to reach those people that aren't in front of a screen day to day?
I wouldn't say that ambition changes. I would actually say the ambition doesn't change at all. But the challenge is that sometimes we can write off certain roles as being harder to reach, and therefore we'll just accept that we might hear from them less, or we'll say frontline colleagues, those who are out working in logistics, for example, on factory floors, they don't care about getting involved in that type of survey. For me, that's a lazy kind of assumption to make around it. We're not leaning enough into the challenge of why do they not get involved in a survey like this. So the listening ambition shouldn't change. The delivery approach should absolutely change. Yeah. So what are the things that you would only ask to colleagues on your front line? It would only be relevant to them. It wouldn't be relevant to anybody else. Use the available kind of technology out there on the listening platform to target questions just to specific job roles.
Yeah.
Because again, I come back to that. If you go out and engage with frontline workers and you ask them, what are your views on the survey that we've ran previously? You'll often hear things like, well, the questions didn't really feel relevant to me. It felt quite disconnected from the work that I'm doing, or they've not had the opportunity to take part in it because the majority of the delivery mechanism of the survey has been via email. How can we go out and get things, posters, coasters in the canteen, using QR codes, having tablets,
posters in the toilet,
all of that kind of stuff. On the back of the door. I need to take part in this. Change it every day. Reminder, take part in this. I think there's lots of things that we can do to meet them where they are.
Yes.
But a big one I like to talk about with organizations is the relevance of the questions. And, this is going to be short and sharp and really focused on your reality rather than the big 50, 60 question survey that it's all going to feel like it's questions for the organization. So some examples, thinking about how to do that as well is rather than very traditional question on a survey, I have everything I need to do my job well. It's in service for years.
Yeah.
Follow-up question to everyone who is neutral or disagree on that question to ask them, well, what's the biggest blocker to you doing your job well, with a multiple choice list of different challenges. Immediately, you're going to get more insight, particularly for a shift leader in a factory, for example, say, right, I really understand what some of these challenges are. Some of them will be things that the business needs to be aware of and needs to act on. Some of them might be quite actionable for a shift leader. So it's about just moving the dial a little bit and making it feel more relevant for that local level or the particular population that we're talking about. So accessibility, relevance of questions. And I would say kind of linked to that is that kind of balance of depth versus reach.
Yeah.
Accept having a slightly smaller survey going out to those frontline workers, but make it feel really relevant, really tangible to them, because you also need to be kind of starting with the end in mind as well. So you need to be thinking about how you're going to get those frontline colleagues to understand what's been learned from the survey itself. And leaders of those types of populations very rarely have all of them together at one time for big, long, kind of meaty team meetings. So you need to be thinking about how are we going to make that side of things really easy for their leaders and managers to be able to get across the top headlines from the survey in 30 seconds. This is what we've heard. This is what we're going to do about it within a week of the survey closing. That's what you need to be prioritizing with the front line.
When it comes to retail and hospitality, an industry that you know well, there tends to be quite high turnover from an employee stance, and employees come, they get trained up and then they lose them quite quickly, or they move to a competitor, etc., because it's a very competitive market as well. What do you think is the actual link between listening and people staying for retail and hospitality?
Well, I think it comes down to wanting to create the right type of environment in stores. So if we're using traditional retail, for example, each store that you have, each branch, if we're in hospitality, each restaurant, each hotel has its own little microculture. And ultimately the guest or the customer experience and the performance of that organization, that individual location is largely going to hinge on whether that's a really strong culture, high performance culture, high performing team or not. And that is largely influenced by the manager in that. And that's the reality of retail and hospitality. So listening, ambition and approach within that particular environment should really focus on understanding what behaviors are being role modeled, what behaviors underpin really high performing culture within that area. Because if you get that right, you will be positively influencing the overall kind of level of attrition. You're always going to have high levels of attrition in that industry, but it's about understanding what can you do to create that right type of environment where people do want to work there, and also use the insight to help you understand beyond that microculture piece and the behavioral role modeling, like what are the things that ultimately will drive people to want to stay there or want to move on. You know, if you have people saying to you in a survey, well, the reason I'm planning on moving on is because I was only ever planning on working here short term while I was at university, for example. Okay, that's understandable. Yeah. But what if people are saying, well, I actually don't feel valued for the work that I do here? You know, it can be quite unsociable hours at times. It would be nice to, you know, have someone kind of thank me or recognize me for the effort that I'm putting in, you know, again, going through those kind of peak periods and seasons. And another part, I think, as well, is really understanding how people do actually feel about career development. So how much are we as industry leaders looking at in a sector like retail and actually thinking about, well, how do we make this a sector where people see it as something long-term and where they actually would want to carve out a career? Yeah. So how can we get more focused insight around how people perceive the sector, what that looks like across different demographics? So some of those younger demographics that we might typically see higher turnover in retail, how do we understand more from them around what they do want out of a career? Yeah. How do we then use that insight to start talking about and positioning retail as an area where they could realize some of those ambitions? I think there's a bit of learned helplessness within the sector that we just accept that high turnover is going to be there, whereas actually we could do more to understand what it is that we can do to create that kind of bigger employee value proposition, brand proposition internally for colleagues where they think, do you know what, this is somewhere that I want to stay for the long term.
Brilliant. Yeah, agreed. I think that would be very exciting for the younger employees and demographic to give them a progression path for the future.
Yeah, and one there's a fashion retailer that we work with. We've been working with for a number of years, and they actually have it's like a reverse mentoring group specifically for Gen Z. Yeah. So, and now Gen Alpha as well. So they want their most senior leaders to understand how those demographics are thinking about the world of work and what they can do to improve it and make it somewhere where they can build their career, but also getting their perspective on the changing nature of fashion itself and around things, what we learned from survey insights, which I think is a really cool way of using insights, is how different demographics actually engage with content and communications, so they can use that as a real key data point for shaping their communication strategy. So for any of our listeners who come from the retail and hospitality space, they will no doubt be listening in thinking it's a lot harder to communicate with people who work out in retail stores, hotels and restaurants. Well, one of the ways to solve that challenge is to actually go out and engage with those populations and understand how they engage with communication, different channel, how much time they spend a day engaging with different content, use all of that to actually think about, well, how do we connect and build proper lasting connections with those individuals? So I think, you know, there's so much more that we can do for our organizations in that sector to just help make a better work experience for people and one where they want to stay.
Brilliant. Thank you. So if you had to pick out 2 takeaways for our viewers from our discussion today on listening maturity and progressing up that listening model, what would they be? And I'm going to ask for only 2 takeaways.
My first one would be really reflect on what listening needs to look like for you and your business now. So, network, understand and look what other organizations are doing, but really do that.
Look at yourself.
Look at yourself. Really think about what your listening needs to look like in year 1 and then what you can progress to, but make it have really kind of clear direction and measurable kind of outcomes as well, to see whether you are making that progress and understand what are going to be the key steps, blockers, enablers for you to be successful. So that listening strategy piece absolutely should be number 1. And then the second one I would say is, as part of that, really think about that leadership engagement piece.
Yeah.
I will always believe in this space that if you don't have your C-suite really connected to this and really truly interested and energized by it, you are going to struggle to have an impact with it. So really exploring and planning out what do we do to build that senior leadership connection to this is really important. And if I think about the fashion retailer that's doing the reverse mentoring piece that I mentioned, in 2024, spring 2024, they were doing the same 12-question survey year on year, and it would become a bit of a tick box to use that kind of language. And they will openly say that it had kind of become a bit like that. They're in a position now where they have quarterly executive leadership team meetings just to look at the action planning progress off the back of surveys. Essentially, the starting point of those sessions is, are we delivering on our commitment to colleagues across the brand when we said we were going to change this as a result of their feedback? How they got there is creating that listening strategy and having the patience and making sure they were asking the right questions in the survey, that they were really thinking about the manager capability. And why I said the leadership engagement piece was the most important, they connected their engagement data to their store performance data. And the story that it told was one that they couldn't ignore. It was one where quite clearly the more engaged stores were putting more money in the till. And that then leads to a completely kind of clear and positive shift in the quality of the conversation. So I would challenge all of our listeners to think about, what's that story in our world? What's our hypothesis? Engagement drives, what is it? And find out the answer. How much is it driving it? Is it driving it? You know, if it's not driving that, what is it driving? And play it back to the leadership team in their language.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ryan. And I think exactly that. It will be there. It's just surfacing it.
Exactly that. Every workplace has its story, and it's just about uncovering it and being able to play that back.
Brilliant. Well, that is so helpful. Thank you for your insights today.
Thank you.
Our other mini pods in the summer series cover managers, employees, and leadership. And you'll find them on the WorkBuzz YouTube channel. If this has inspired you to start a listening journey and think about your program, then please get in contact with us or visit www.workbuzz.com, and you can get in touch to talk even more with myself or Ryan or any of our team to think about your listening maturity. Thank you for joining.